Wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Small Business Success Series October webinar. And my name is Jennifer Hall, and I found a company called Matchkey Consulting, and we're a training and professional organization that focuses on millennials and women. And I also serve as the chairman board of the GNFCC Foundation, and the foundation actually oversees the NextGen Connects, which obviously is today's event, and other leadership programs. So we have some really awesome stuff going on for people of all ages. Today's panel is going to feature top industry leaders that are going to be discussing relevant workforce ideas, such as misperceptions in the workplace and stereotypes and bridging the generation gap. And we had to stop there because we only have an hour. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Hillary Liu. And Hillary is a graduate of Georgia Tech and currently works with the City of Alpharetta's Special Events Division, where she produces annual food, music, and art festivals for one of the fastest growing cities in the state, and of course, a part of our chamber. She leads her experience in event planning to other nonprofits, also by serving on the board of the Atlanta International Night Market and on Concrete Jungle's Event Planning Committee. I'd like to hear about that. Hillary, thanks for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, I'm looking forward for our panelists today on how we can be better communicators with our employers and employees in the workplace. So much has changed in the past years, and some of the best practice advice is always helpful. So let's get started. Our panel today will feature Tanya Morris, the founder and CEO of Simply HR, Inc., Dr. Carolyn White-Fore, author of Millennials Taking the Lead, and Josh Rogers of Joshua Rogers Consulting. So if our audience has any questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll have our Q&A session at the end of the program to get to as many questions as time allows. And our first panelist today is Tanya Morris with Simply HR. Tanya founded Simply HR with a vision to be the #1 resource for connecting generations in the workplace. With more than 25 years experience, Tanya brings innovative and practical solutions to clients looking to improve profitability, build a strong organizational structure, and a generational inclusive workplace. She's known for turning chaos into structure. She's certified as a diversity practitioner, DISC facilitator, Myers-Briggs executive coach, and mindset coach. Tanya, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you guys so much for spending this time with us this morning. I want to go ahead and share my screen because I want to talk to you guys about a topic that I think is near and dear. If I can somebody let me share my screen? I can't share it. Okay. So I want to talk to you guys about a topic that is so near and dear to my heart. And it's about how do we work with a generational and how do we work in a generation inclusive workplace? And so with that in mind, I want to give you some tools to think about what we can do and some of the things that are preventing us from working in this type of environment. I know we all have experienced so much this year, and I believe that I've always said the employees you had in January may not be the employees you have right now because there's been so much trauma. There's been so much pandemic, things that are going on. So I want to just kind of talk about how do we do that? How do we work in a generation inclusive workplace? And if you're thinking about it, I'm glad that you asked. And if you want to ask about it, I'm here to tell you about it. So to begin, let's talk about what the workforce encompasses. So when you think about the workforce, we have 5 generations for the first time working side by side, right? 5 generations. And we're going to talk about some of these generations, who they are and some of their communication styles, because I think it's very important for us to know that in order for us to be an inclusive workplace. So first, let's start with our traditionals. They are our largest generation in the workplace. We have known them to be really the pioneers of the workforce. They were born in 1946. We got about 7 million still in the workplace. And yes, they're still in the workplace contributing. And some of you may have them in the workplace and some of them you may not, but for the most part, they are still actively in the workplace. Their work style. we all know work hard and pay dues. And the reason why I'm saying that, telling you guys this here is because we know that how we work expectations have evolved. So I just want to give you guys a preview. Their communication style, not to say that they can't use technology, but for in the workplace, their best communication style is to see you face to face. So if you are a different generation, just know that if they want to come in your office and see your face, that's their preferred way of communicating. And then again, their work expectation, they really want you to listen to them. They have a whole lot of stories to tell you. They've seen a whole lot. And so really listening, you can learn a lot from them. And then our next generation is the baby boomers. They're the second largest generation. I've talked about generation born 1946 and 1964. We got about 76 million of them in the workplace. Their work style, they're going to work hard. This generation pretty much occupy a lot of the leadership roles. And so they're known for being workaholics. In some cases, hard work equals accomplishment for them. And their communication style, if they had to choose one, pick up the phone and call me. They will answer the phone. They're probably one of the few generations that will answer the phone, right? So this is the second largest generation in the workplace. And then their work expectation, they want to be known that they're doing a good job. That is their MO. I'm going to do a good job. I'm going to be loyal, but I'm going to do a good job. Then our next generation, which is the third largest generation, and this is my generation, so I can pick on myself. We are the sandwich generation. And in some organization, we are the Passover and ticked off generation, right? We're the third largest generation, born 1965 and 1980, 66 million strong, okay? Now, our work style, we are independent. We came into the workplace being independent because guess what? Some of us had to take care of our siblings, so we owned the leadership role because we know we were independent, so we walked into the organizations being independent. Not that we can't work with others, but we have an independent mindset if you think of that. Our communication style, we will send you an email in a minute. We will send you a hot email, great email. But for the most part, our communication style is to email you. And we were one of the first generation that really tapped into technology, which was the email portion of it. So we know a little bit about, emails, but I want you guys to remember us because we are often not talked about. And then we were the first generation that talked about work-life balance because we've seen our parents miss our ballet classes and games and different things of that nature. So we brought the concept about, what about work-life balance? Can we do a little bit of that? So this is a generation you can thank for just even bringing this up and wanting this here. Then our next generation, which is our number one largest generation in the workplace, is the millennials. They are the most talked about, and I am going to say most misunderstood generation. They were born after 1986. I mean, 1981, excuse me. 81 million of them in the workplace. Some say they are disruptors. I say they are in a good way. So I love my millennials. So kudos to the millennials. Not that I don't like the other generations, but this generation has really taken a little beating with the stereotypes, and we're going to talk about that today. But this generation here, their work style, they work to live and not to work. I mean, they can get the job done, but they really understand that work matters, but their life matters as well. So I love this concept because then we're now seeing a little bit more how the workforce is changing, right? So you got one generation, they loyalty, they're gonna be there. You got this generation here, I work to live, but not to work. And that's an interesting twist, and we're gonna talk about that. And then their communication style, we know that they can email, they can text, and they can definitely tweet. They like apps. So they have a different way of communication. Not to say any of it is bad, but they have a different way of communication. They like to communicate. And then we just talked about workplace expectations. We know that work-life integration is so important to them. They live on their technology. You know, I have two boys. I got one is a Gen Z and one a millennial, and I would have never thought in my day that they sleep with their telephones, and I never thought they would do that. But this is their life, work-life integration. It all comes together. And then Gen Z, our generation Z is the youngest generation in the workplace. It's about 3 to 5 million in the workplace right now, but they're the earlier. They're coming in early in their careers. Some of them right out of high school, some of them right out of college. And what we know about them is that they work work-life integration, their communication style, we know is all app. And I can just tell you, I have a son and I don't know his telephone number. We just text. I don't know his telephone number. So we say a lot about, these different generations, but I want to talk to you today about, because we got 5 generations in some organization or 4, how do we have an inclusive workplace? What do we need to do? Because it's important for you guys to understand that we all have differences, how we see work, how we work, where we work, how we communicate, what's important to us, what's motivating to us. And I want to talk about 2 things that prohibit us from having an inclusive workplace. And so the first one is the stereotypes. How many of you guys are tired of the stereotypes? You want them to get to know who you are. And so for me, let's talk about stereotypes. And I'm going to pick on a couple generations, but you guys have heard, put in the chat some of the things you may have heard about the different stereotypes. But I want to say we overgeneralize in labeling different generations because we really don't know them. And, I hear all the time, millennials are very lazy, they're entitled. I tell you, I hire millennials, they're the most entrepreneur, go-getter, bossed up generation that will get things done. And then we hear about, say for example, the baby boomers, they want to be mom. No, baby boomers are very hard workers. They have put their stake in the ground. And when they start something, they want to finish it. So I think we have to make sure that we do not take stereotype and make that be our lens of who the generations that we're working with. Sometimes when we're doing stereotypes, we have images and ideas of a particular type of person, but we don't get to know them. So I believe that stereotypes keep us from knowing one another, keep us from being inclusive. We put all these labels on one another. And then the next one is this unconscious bias, and it's known as explicit bias and implicit bias. Let me just break it down a little bit. Implicit bias refers to attitudes and beliefs we have about a person or group on a conscious bias. It's something we just have an idea, we know this about a person. But implicit bias refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. For example, I may say for my son, I'm going to use my son as an example. And Austin, he's a millennial. And so I'm like, Austin, you don't know how to communicate to your mom. Well, Austin may say, yes, I do. I text you and I FaceTime you. Isn't that not a form of communication? And so I may stereotype and say, you know what, he doesn't know how to communicate because he don't communicate the way I want him to communicate. So I want you to think about when you're in the workplace, and we have all these generations in the workplace working side by side, and you don't even know anything about a generation. It's just about what you heard. So I want to encourage you to be aware of your unconscious bias, because oftentimes our unconscious bias prevent us from having good relationship, having collaboration, and working, inclusively in the workplace. So how do we get rid of these and reduce unconscious bias? And I want to give you 4 ways. I want you to slow down and think about decisions and processes we most likely like to give to our unconscious bias. I want you to think about that. I want you to slow down and think about it. What do we give to our unconscious bias? And then I want you to E, which is to empathize with the feeling and the viewpoints of others. Oftentimes, we don't empathize and try to understand one another. The old adage of walking in someone else's shoes, that's the next step. And then we want to learn about different diversity groups. I believe in order for us to be an inclusive workplace, we got to learn about one another. We got to learn their backstory. Why do they do the things they do? Why they work the way they do? And if we can learn about different diversity groups in our organization, such as a different generation, we can move towards reducing bias, unconscious bias in the workplace. And so F, we want to find evidence against stereotypes. So when you think about this whole model that I'm telling you about, I want you to think about self. Are you going to slow down and think about decisions and procedures that you're making as it relates to your workplace? Are you going to empathize with different generations, different cultures, different diversity? Are you going to try to learn about each person or each diversity and then find evidence against stereotype? Research demonstrates that unconscious bias stereotype, it can really make a big difference in your organization. So are you guys ready to just reduce, or more importantly, to avoid unconscious bias? Now, many of you may be saying, Tanya, I'm not conscious. We all have unconscious bias. But the biggest thing is for us to be aware that they exist. So one of the things I want to say to you this morning is that although we are different, we come in different eras, we have commonalities. We got something to talk about. And I say this to you because oftentimes we focus so much on our differences. And so let's talk about some of the quick commonalities that we do have. We all want effective leadership. I have not met not one person in the organization, not one generation that did not want great leadership. Then we all want opportunities. They may look different, but we do want opportunities. And then some form of work-life balance, whether it's work-life integration, work-life balance, we all want that. But this big one here, we want respect. I can't tell you how many times that we work with one another and we do not respect the way we work, the way we communicate, the way we want things. So I encourage you to learn to respect one another. And the last, but certainly not least, if you're a leader, we got to appreciate one another. We got to appreciate our thought. We got to appreciate our backgrounds. We got to be appreciative of the things that we bring to the organization. So I want you to understand that we do have something in common. And last but not least, I want to say to you, how do we work in a generation inclusive workplace? And I am so glad you're thinking about it. You may be chatting about it and you may be asking, well, how do you do that, Tanya? I know we have 5 generations in the workplace. I know we need to avoid stereotype and unconscious bias. And I just learned that we have so much in common. But I want to take it a step further. And I want to say to you that we need to do one thing. And I want to introduce to you my care model, simply care. Now, many of you may be saying, well, it got to be more than that. Oh, it is more than that. But I want to give you an insight of it. We got to communicate with one another. We have to learn what's the best way of communicating, start talking and building those relationships. We have so many different ways that we can do that. We know that we have different resources and technology to allow us to communicate. And I will say communication has evolved. There is no one way of communicating. I want to give this quick story. I know when my husband and I, we go to dinner with the boys, and, you know, typically when you go to a restaurant, you know, you talk, right? I can remember going and we were escorted to our table and I saw one universal way of communicating. All ages, all races, all gender, different genders, I should say, one posture. Everybody was bent over and they were looking at their phone. I know my sons, when they're communicating, they're texting pictures of their food. So that's their way of communicating. And then the next way we got to appreciate, we talked about that a little bit, but we really have to find ways to communicate our employees. And keep in mind, since we got 45 generations in the workplace, we all want to be appreciated differently. Learn what works for your team, your workforce. And then respect, we talked about respect. Respect how I work. You know, respect what I say, the things that I do, my whole thought process. So respect is so important in the workplace. This is the number one reason why I see discord in the workplace, because we don't understand that respect is for all and not just for one. And last, and certainly not least, is to engage. When the last time have you engaged with somebody that's different than you, to learn different? If you employ the care model, I can guarantee you, you will begin to have a generational inclusive workplace. I know my time is up. I just want to give you some tidbits on how we can have a generational inclusive workplace. And I encourage you to employ the care model. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. And next we're going to hear from Josh Rogers with Joshua Rogers Consulting. Josh is a well-rounded real estate professional who previously worked in the world of affordable housing with Habitat for Humanity International as a real estate and finance paralegal. Josh is the curator of a weekly blog called The J Word, a cultural think piece that provides a unique perspective on current events through the lens of faith, self-care, and social responsibility. Josh, great to have you with us today. As a recent college grad, you entered the workplace as the youngest employee in your office. Now a generation is coming in behind you. What are some of the cultural differences you have seen?
Sure. So that's kind of what I want to base the conversation that I'll be leading right now around culture and how organizations and individuals can embrace it, and how individuals within those work cultures can present as their authentic selves and kind of merge their work and who they are together. So for me, culture is one of the driving forces of what we do, who we are, and how we create, right? Everything, whether you are thinking about it subconsciously or consciously, revolves around culture in some type of way. And I often say that culture will eat strategy for breakfast. And what I really mean by that is that a lot of times how the world operates around us can have really rapid change on what we may have planned within our organizations, what we may have planned inside of some of our internal teams. So if we're not always adapting and understanding what's happening around us, and also really learning and embracing the people who work with us and for us, then I think we can find ourselves lost when we don't maximize and combine cultural practices with strategic thrust. So one of the ways that we can do that is within your organization, make your specific culture clear, because culture can trump competency. All right. So what I mean by that is that a lot of times I think we focus, and a lot of times organizations focus on the training aspect, which is absolutely necessary, right? We want to make sure people are skilled beyond their formal education, beyond some of their experience in previous jobs. So we want to make sure that they are competent at their work. We also want to understand and help them understand the culture in which that organization operates. One of the past firms that I worked for had it was very millennial heavy. So we kind of heard about the differences in generational working types, but the culture of that organization came from a very traditionalist mindset, right? So how the people and the people within the organization presented and who they were, their working styles, did not necessarily match what the culture of that organization was. So there was a lot of friction that happened a lot of times. And one of the main reasons why that occurred was because there was no clear direction on what the organization's cultural stance was. So you have to make culture clear, and then you have to teach the competency of that culture. The second thing that organizations must do is also identify cultural values, why they are important. Why do these things matter to us? How does it benefit each generation? How do we make sure that these cultural values are inclusive across a range of individuals, regardless of race, sex, orientation, any type of identifying factor, all right? And then drive the culture through your planning efforts. Always have these questions in mind when you're presenting. Why are we doing this? How does it benefit me? And or how does it benefit a project, right? And then is it long-term or is it short-term residual effects? And then implement the things that you want to do, that you want to accomplish through the lens of the culture that you have just created. All right. So these are some of the ways that you can make sure that as the workplace is shifting from a demographic standpoint, as the workplace is shifting from the entire outlook of everyone who is there, that you are staying upbeat in ways that allows you to effectively communicate and effectively work with each individual, no matter what level of diversity they bring to the table. Because what we want to encourage through our cultural practices, no matter what they are, is that every single person has the ability to present as their authentic selves. I think so many times there's this huge focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we do a lot of really great work in diversity, but we don't always do a lot of great work in inclusion. I think we celebrate the statistics that shows us that we have this percentage of African Americans and this percentages, of white employees and this percentage of Asian employees and Latinx and all these different types of things. But I think in practice, right, we fail to actually figure out how do we include all of these people, their differences, how they operate, their backgrounds, right? I don't think it is necessarily our responsibility to be historians on every single person and their background, but I do think it is greatly beneficial to understand that a level of inclusion must take place to make sure that all of this diversity can work together in harmony. And a lot of times that comes through things like employee resource groups, that comes through having an HR department that is prepared and skilled to know how to manage the different needs and nuances of different people and their cultures, and cultivating a workspace that is open, that is honest, that is transparent, that is not afraid of conversations, and that is willing to handle tough conversation and address social norms, that address social woes, and have a great level of social responsibility within the workplace. Because as we are working within these places, a lot of things on the outside can affect our psychological capacity. It can affect our mental capacity. And if we don't have certain spaces within our work, if these things are not ingrained and built within our culture, it can definitely affect how that person performs on their job, what their attitude is, how they rub up against culture that day, because they may have been affected by things outside of the workplace. So that brings me to my next point, that we must have a differentiation between our culture, so your culture as an organization, and the culture, right? So your culture is what your mission and purpose is, what your identity is as an organization, the values that you have, the community that you sit in, versus the culture are things like hot topics, current events, institutional values, and the society. So while a lot of us know that in corporate spaces, we don't necessarily talk about politics and religion and things like that, but we are in the midst of a very heated election. No matter where you fall on the fence, we can't deny that this is a very, it's all in our face. So to ignore it, in a sense, to me, is a lack of social irresponsibility. But at the same time, we must be carefully nuanced in how we approach it, but also allow people the space to feel and to emote in a way that is healthy, but also shows them that you care. So understanding what's happening in culture. So if someone says, hey, I just need a mental health day, going back to millennials, they work to live, they don't live to work. So a lot of times, if they need that mental health day, understanding that they're not being lazy that day, it's just that they may have reached a level of mental capacity that would affect their work. So instead of being on a job all day and maybe not producing, let me take a seat back, get myself together and come back to the table really energized, prepared and ready, and with greater clarity on what I'm needing to do. So understanding the delicacy and the sensitivities of the culture will help you best implement all the things that you've had and you've prepared for your culture as an organization. So as I'm getting ready to wrap up, I will wrap up this way, talking about, if you have certain culture now and you're trying to figure out, how do I bridge the gap between what we've established as an organization and some of the things that we want to do and accomplish with our employees, is just identify the margin and fill the gap with what is said and what is executed. That's what your gap is, right? So on your website, in your set of documents, you have this list of things that is said, right? You have all these great things. We believe this, we believe that, we're committed to this, we're committed to that. But then there's, on the other end of the spectrum, what is actually executed in practice. Somewhere in the middle is where you need to figure it out. And how you figure that out is learning that the biggest deficit to your platform is in that gap, and you close the margin by merging the two. How do you merge the two? You implement it through strategic thrusts that are in 4 different ways. You do it through relational aspects. So you build relationship and great communication. You identify the things that matter the most to your employees and you as an organization. You make sure that you're implementing it through intellect. What are some of the things we need to learn as an organization? What are some of the things that we want our employees to learn and to be skilled in? So continuing education, learning and resource development, professional development, right? Not being afraid to allow the professionals within your organization and your culture to continue to develop, even if that means outside of your organization. Because sometimes there are great programs that happen that are third-party programs that maybe your organization organization. It could be a small business. It could be just maybe an antiquated business, if we're being honest, that may not have some of the professional development tools necessary to push maybe some of your millennials and your Gen Zers forward. So encouraging continuing education in that thing. And then also implement it through the lens of strength. Have a very clear vision, right? Have a very clear vision. So while your vision and your mission may not ever change, there are some things, the way in which you implement them changes, right? If we could think about it like a math problem. 2 + 2 will always be 4. But for any of you who may have children right now, you learn math a specific way. I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. The way that they're calculating math is very, very, very different than how I did it. So what that tells me is that while the sum of that equation may always be 4, there are so many ways for me to get to that answer, right? So the same thing happens for you. While your culture may be your vision and mission may be the same thing that it was from 1986, and that is okay. But how are we implementing that in 2020? What are some of the things that we're doing now to make sure that we can communicate that effectively, right? How are we bridging the gap between the traditionalist popping up in an office versus the millennial who wants to use Slack and maybe Trello boards to communicate and post up work, right? Are we even understanding some of the systems? Do we have knowledge about some of these systems? So your goal is to exegete the culture. What do I mean by exegete? Is to really understand and operationally define the culture and then execute everything that you want as an organization through the lens and the beauty of the human experience. All right, I hope that was helpful. That's all I have. Thank you, Hillary, and I appreciate and look forward to questions at the end if you have any.
Thank you, Josh. And our final panelist is Carolyn White-Four, author of Millennials Taking the Lead. Dr. Carolyn White-Four has many years of leadership experience in a corporate environment with responsibility for multi-generational teams. During those years, she saw firsthand the differences in the leadership styles of leaders from different generational groups. She wrote her doctoral dissertation on next generation leadership, focusing on millennials as leaders. Carolyn used her research and experience to write the book Millennials Taking the Lead, which offers insight into what has shaped the leadership styles of millennials and how older generations can learn to appreciate their contribution to their businesses, vice versa. Carolyn, thank you for joining us today. As you know, millennials are one of the up-and-coming generations in the workforce. As a seasoned professional and one who has done significant research on this generation and their work styles, what have you found?
So I'm going to talk to you about leadership and how I view leadership. And I'm having the benefit of being third on the panel. I get to build on the great things that Tanya and Josh said about the characteristics of the different generations and the culture and values in the organization and how those are portrayed. And even though we did not actually coordinate what we were saying in terms of the details, it flows nicely. You may hear a little bit of repetition about some of the things that are being said about the generations, which I think helps reinforce that information, but also I'm going to focus it on how we see this portrayed in leadership styles, which is really my area of focus. So what happened was that in my time as an organizational leader, developing my own team of leaders from a multi-generational group, I saw that they often leaned toward different styles of leadership, depending on the generational group they were part of. And by the way, I'm a baby boomer, so now we have a third of the 5 generations represented. While we're all individuals and we don't want to stereotype people, as Tanya discussed, research has identified trends in what we have as expectations for leadership traits for different age groups. So I'll talk about some of those leadership styles and traits. Starting with the oldest, there aren't a lot of traditionalists left in the workplace since these individuals are now at least 75 years old. But you may still be working with a few that are part of your organization, or even if they've retired, their influence is still felt in your organization. This group of leaders tends to be autocratic, they expect hierarchy, and they rely on what we refer to as command and control. The next group is the baby boomers, which was once the largest group of workers, and there's still a lot of baby boomers in the workplace, even though they're retiring at a rapid rate right now. This group is between the age of 56 and 74. Their leadership style tends to be more democratic and collegial. They prefer consensus building as leaders. They're accustomed to making decisions, but like for everyone to get along and buy into their approach. Generation X is next and less about consensus building and more into being collaborative as leaders. They believe competence is key and information is power. Their style lends toward laissez-faire or letting things take their course with less interference from their leaders. These leaders, who are now between the ages of 41 and 55, are taking over positions vacated by retiring baby boomers, and they frequently express their frustration about feeling squeezed out by millennials, since they are the sandwich group, the smaller group between two larger groups. Millennials are the group we hear so much about because their entry into the workforce triggered 4 generations working together for the first time in history. This group is also just as large as the baby boomers, and now that baby boomers are retiring, millennials have surpassed them as the largest group in the workforce. As leaders, millennials tend to be both collaborative and inclusive, and they like sharing responsibility. They're much more casual, creative, and innovative than previous generations and rely on technology and social media for information and networking. The oldest millennials are turning 40 this year, so they've become well established in their organizations, and many have taken on roles as organizational leaders. So research on generations is not an exact science, as you may have figured out. So what you read about the ages doesn't always agree and can change over time as more data is collected. Millennials were once thought to be born between 1980 and 2000, but the lower age range has now changed to 1995 and is becoming more accepted that Gen Z is those that are born in 1996 and later. So what do we know about Gen Z? They are 24 years old and younger. And while they probably have a leadership style or a developing one, there's not been enough research to really talk about that. What I can say about this generation now entering the workplace is that they are the first generation to grow up not knowing life without the internet everywhere and smartphones and being constantly connected or having access, immediate access to whatever they are looking for. They are truly the digital natives, which has influenced their communication style, as Tanya talked about, and how they search out information and make decisions. This will have an impact on our organizations as more of them join the workplace and take on leadership roles. Some general Gen Z traits are that they are the most ethnically diverse and technologically sophisticated generation, and they are on track to be the most well-educated generation yet. And you may be aware that those are attributes previously given to millennials. Gen Z has an informal, individual, and very straightforward way of communicating, and social media is a vital part of their lives. They are also considered a do-it-yourself generation. So in spite of differences, we know that there's some common themes across leaders of all generations. It's pretty well accepted that leaders need to be honest, trustworthy, and have integrity, although even these concepts may have different interpretations by different generations. If we look at honesty, research shows us that all leaders think honesty is important and rank it in the top 5 traits of leaders, but not all of them listed in the same position in the top 5. And closely related to honesty is trust. As leaders, we all want to be able to be trusted and to trust our leaders. But depending on where you are in the generational cohorts, you may place a different emphasis on trust. For example, to a traditionalist, trust means allegiance to the organization or trust in the company to do the right thing. Baby boomers are trusting others to accomplish the goals together. They believe in teamwork. Gen X is the questioning generation, deciding who to trust and challenging the status quo. Millennials put their trust in relationships. They are looking for transparency, and they're working together for the greater good. As for Gen Z, I don't have real data on this group, but suspect their trust is information-based. They seem to trust in knowledge or relationships and how well they know someone in order to trust them. So what's important to us is based on our values, and we develop our values between the ages of 5 and 18. So these are formed by the time we enter the workforce. So stop for a second and think about what the world was like when you were those ages, between 5 and 18. Now think about what the world was like when each of these groups we've been talking about were developing their values. For traditionalists, their values were highly influenced by World War II and the Depression. Baby boomers grew up during the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the beginning of space exploration. Gen X grew up learning about Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and hearing about corporate layoffs, which often left their parents without jobs. As for millennials, they grew up during a time when there was a focus on children, which was very positive for them, but they also grew up during 9/11, a time of increased violence, the school shootings, and the Iraq War, all while technology was developing at a very rapid rate. It's questionable whether a younger age has been set for Gen Z, but it's likely around 2016, which means Gen Z is currently between 8 and 24. Most of them are still in those value-defining years with a good many years to go, so there may be more defining moments on the horizon. However, there's no denying that Gen Z will be influenced by polarizing politics and the pandemic. And it's interesting to note that Gen Z doesn't remember some of the defining moments of our recent history, 9/11 and the 2008 recession. The reason I mention these things is that the shared experiences of generational cohorts shape feelings that become shared values. Different generations often express their values in different ways, that can then lead to conflict between age groups. So at work, baby boomers tend to be hard workers, have a lot of patience, and value soft skills. Gen X looks for openness, respect for diversity, curiosity, and practicality. Millennials expect flexibility, mobility, creativity, and have a broader superficial knowledge than previous generations. They're very success-oriented and expect freedom of information. Gen Z is known to live for the present and react rapidly. They are initiators and they have immediate information access and content search. In some cases, values themselves may not have changed, but the way of exhibiting these values may have changed. For example, family can be an important value to all ages. Older workers care about their families, and the way they show this is to work hard to provide for their family. Younger workers prefer to work fewer hours, spending more time at home with their family as a way of showing how much they care about them. These different ways of viewing the same value, family, can cause conflict at work, and that's just one example of many. So to summarize, here are a couple of takeaways from what I've covered. A lot of issues relating to misunderstanding generational differences can be resolved, or at least minimized, if people take the opportunity to see how the culture of a person's background, in this case, time period, affects their views. This applies to all sorts of cultural differences if you try to understand how the other person developed their values. But frequently we forget or discount the fact that we are a product of the time period we were raised in and who our peers are. And then when thinking of why people see leadership differently, it ties back to all the different perspectives. But in a simple word, it helps to remember what is the key to each generation for leadership. For traditionalists, it's hierarchy. For baby boomers, it's consensus. For Gen X, it's competence. For millennials, it's guidance. And for Gen Z, I suspect it's lack of boundaries and everything in an instant. So I hope that's helped you see a little bit about how we are different as leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. We do have a few previously submitted questions to ask you all. And I guess if you specifically want to answer one, please speak up and I'll try to see if I can direct them to those who might be great at answering them. So recruiting employees is different for each generation. How can companies attract and retain talent in today's market? I think maybe Tanya might be a great for this one.
You know, you need to go where they're at. That's simplest part of them. You need to go where they're at. And what I mean by that, you got, for example, that generation definitely want to use the digital platforms such as Twitter and IG, and you can hire and recruit on those platforms. Oftentimes we think that, ZipRecruiter, Indeed work. I have found that when I go where they're hanging out, I get the best results. And then also you want to go to places, well, right now we're in a remote world right now, so we're not really going out to networking place. But from a digital standpoint, I think you get more from a digital platform. There are some out there on LinkedIn as well. I'm hiring right now. I went to Twitter, went to Instagram, and I got about 50 people out there. So I think you can use that platform.
And as far as like retention, what kind of expectations do you think would need to be, or like, do you think that the generations are looking for?
And I spoke earlier about the commonality, but if we're specifically talking about a generation, a particular generation, I think we have to understand what motivates them and then the purpose of them coming into the workplace. Some of us came to work because we had to, all right? Some of us are coming for a purpose. They want to be able to, and not to say that we all don't have purpose, but it just looks a little bit different. So I would say that learning is a great way, continuing professional development is definitely a great way to keep them engaged from a retention standpoint. But I do think that you have to add the piece of belonging. You have to have a workforce that when everyone feel like they belong in the workplace, that they can get along, meaning that you embrace diversity, you embrace collaboration, the work is fun. What's the employer doing outside of the workplace? Because I know the generation, millennials and Gen Z, they like a lot of community work. What are you doing outside of the workplace so they can be involved? So they, like I stated before, they like work-life integration. So that's my take on it. I'm sure the others have other takes on it as well.
Yeah. Anyone else want to respond as well? Okay, we have another question, which is how has the remote work affected the different generations?
You want me to take that? Have you already started anyway? Maybe some other people want to add to it. But so I see a couple of things going on there. One is the technology gap is huge in this area. So you have the fact that the older generations are struggling with working with the technology and learning it. And so they're not as comfortable with it. And they also are not the ones who really wanted to go to remote work.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea of working remotely was really introduced by Gen X, and then millennials picked it up because they like to work anywhere and be very mobile. So it's a struggle for the older generation. But then I see another factor that's part of it too. And I think that's the one that most people think of is the technology. But there's also a socialization issue going on. And you have the Gen X who, as Tanya said, is really happy to send an email. And they just as soon, I mean, I found that in my workplace, there could be a Gen X that sat a row over from my office who wouldn't walk over to my office and talk to me. They would send an email. And I'd say, why did you do that? Well, why not? That was their preferred method of communicating. And so while that even more increases the fact that they are comfortable with technology and they prefer to use email, whereas the older generation would rather see you in person, but millennials like the mix. So while they're very comfortable with the technology, I don't think they're as comfortable being at home all the time. They want to do both. They seem, in the ones that I've talked to or been around, want to be able to be flexible on this and are not enjoying the isolation, even though they are very connected by social media. They also want to be out in front of people. Some thoughts on that being a millennial?
Yeah, as a card-carrying millennial, I can tell you, I can tell you that that is really true. I think one of the things that we've experienced is this concept of Zoom fatigue. So while we're comfortable with all the technology, be it Zoom, Skype, or whatever you're using, it's overwhelming and it's daunting. And like, I'm naturally an introvert, but my introvert cup is full. So just going to sit in a Starbucks and doing the work, you know, to Carolyn's point, it's about being in the mix and having the opportunity to see someone else working on a cool project, and maybe never saying anything to them, but just being inspired by their work and what they're doing. Because even if you look at some of more millennial-esque and Gen Z-esque workspaces, they're open, right? We're going away from this concept of a lot of closed offices. So we may not have a lot. I think we enjoy the ability to have the option. I think that's what it is. The pandemic has taken that away from us. So I think there's a combination of things with technology, with we no longer have the option to be able to interact and to integrate our work and our socialization in a combined way and effort.
And I want to just add a little bit to what Josh and Carolyn said. I do believe that there's some advantages and there's some disadvantages, as we just illustrated. But for the biggest piece is that, you know, you want to find a way to feel included and belonging. I'm big on belonging because I do believe in the workforce has changed, and we do have to put those elements in the workplace. So like Carolyn said, there's some generations, like the older, that they worked all their lives in the office, and now they're isolated. And then you got the mix with the millennials and the Gen Zs. I mean, the millennials are having a mix of that. But I think that what we need to make sure, and the gap, is that we are all dealing with this is so different. You know, I know for me, I'm an extrovert, and I promise you, I had a little touch of depression when I couldn't see anybody face to face. So I do think that I don't think you have the transparency as you once had in the office, or could have in the office, by working, you know, the remote world. Remote world has its challenges because people are not set up accurately to work from home. I mean, you know, we're all now software companies. We got to figure it out. And so that's been a challenge to the workplace as well.
Thank you all for answering these questions. And it looks like that's all the time we have for today. So we hope you've enjoyed today's program. This event was brought to you by NextGen Connects, a program of the Greater North Fulton Chamber to engage, recognize, and develop GNFCC's future leaders. If you're interested in finding out more about this Young Professionals program, please contact the Chamber. Now I'd like to turn our program back over to Jennifer for our closing remarks.
Thank you, Hillary, for serving as our moderator, and thank you to our panelists, Tanya Morris with Simple HR, Dr. Carolyn White-Four, author of Millennials Take the Lead, and Josh Rogers with Josh Rogers Consulting. I got so much out of it. I wish we could do this for a couple more hours, but we can't. So thank you all for your time. We appreciate that. I wanted to mention that we did do a quick drawing before our session, and everyone that had registered had their name in the hat, and the winners are getting one of the books. So from Tanya as well as from Carolyn. And our winners for our winner for Millennials Taking the Lead is Brittany Ware, and for Compassionate Work, which is Tanya's book, is Emily Armentrout. So we will reach out to you and make sure that you get your book. And thank you, Tanya and Carolyn, for donating this book. And these, I'm sure, are available online. And if you have any questions about how to find them, certainly reach out to Tanya or Carolyn on that. Our next chamber event is actually going to be next week. It's going to be a WellStar monthly event, which we do. This particular one is going to be featuring our Women Influencing Business Awards. Some might know of this as Women in Business. And we have a keynote presentation by Marcia Miller, who is the founder of Mud Pie. And that is going to be held on next Tuesday, the 27th at 11 a.m. Men are welcome, so not just for women. Please register on the website if you're interested, or again, you can call the chamber. The website is gnfcc.com. So that you can get the Zoom information. And thank you all for joining us today. If you want to get involved in this group, whether you're a member or not of the chamber, we'd love to have you. And I hope everybody has a great day. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all.